Is our next speaker, Ron Mallon. So Ron is professor of philosophy, neuroscience, psychology at Washington University. He works in moral psychology, philosophy of mind, cognitive science, experimental philosophy, social sciences, ethics, and social and political philosophy. So his focus and his work has been focused on social categories, social roles, racial cognition, and the evolution of morality, among many others. And they're developed in a number of papers and his wonderful book, The Social Construction of Humankind. Ron, it's a great honor to have you with us today. And the title of your talk is Accumulation Mechanism, Structural Oppression, and Structural Justice.
Thank you very much. Could you allow me to screen share?
You're in co-host. Okay. Should work now.
Let's see. All right. Thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. It's an honor to find myself on a program with such other distinguished speakers whose work I admire so much. Today I want to talk a little bit about something that I've been thinking about that I call accumulation mechanisms and their connection to structural oppression and structural justice. So one thing I want to do is just talk about the idea of accumulation mechanisms. And then the second thing is really to try to draw a kind of idea about accumulation mechanisms out and see what you think about that. So I'm going to be talking about structure. And of course, as we've already seen, there's a lot of ways that's used. And here I'm going to try to use it to pick out cultural material and institutional features that are the result of past individual and collective behaviors, and then form a kind of background for individual and collective behaviors in the present. Now, I say that to be kind of intentionally vague and to gesture at the kind of things that I want to think about in terms of structure. And I try to be concrete when I think about structures. And one thing I go back to is my own home city of St. Louis. This on your screen now is what's called a racial dot map. Essentially what the people at the Cooper Center at the University of Virginia did. Yes,
Ron, you're not, your slides aren't progressing.
Okay.
Work in display mode.
I'm going to stop sharing and resume. Let's try that.
I guess it only requires display.
Stop share.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to try this again.
Yes. Works.
All right, do you see a map now?
Yes.
Yeah, we got it. Go back
Great.
and show the previous slide since we can read it really quickly because we didn't get to see it.
Sure. There's my structure,
Okay.
my account of structure. Cultural material and institutional features. Okay. So what this map depicts is my home city of St. Louis. What the authors did, or the creators of this map did, is place a single dot on the map for every person reported in the 2010 US Census data, and those dots are color-coded by race. So this, I think, is an incredibly interesting kind of thing, kind of way to see your home city. I have a question. Can you see a pointer? You can't see any indicator. I'll just describe. So what you see pretty obviously is in the upper right corner of the map, which is North St. Louis. You see neighborhoods that are comprised almost 100% of African Americans. And when you go below that line, Del Mar Boulevard, which is a street, you see lots more blue dots, which indicate white respondents to the census, more red dots indicating Asian respondents, and so forth. Looking down the center of the screen, beneath the line, you see a lot of areas that are racially mixed. And when you go out west, you see neighborhoods that are largely white. However, they're not as homogeneously white as the areas in the upper right corner are homogeneously African American. So this is, of course, a kind of racial or ethnic sorting that's occurred in St. Louis, and there are a lot of different causes of it, but it also has a lot of different effects. So if we look, sorry, on this Del Mar Boulevard line, you see where that bend is. If we look, that's the same bend in this photo. If we look At the north side of that line, we see drastically different home values, incomes, education levels, racial makeups, which we already noted, but also we could talk about medical or outcomes, pollution, the number of trees in the neighborhood, and so on, and so on, and so on. So these are very material kinds of consequences of structure. So many explanations of structural inequality focus upon systemic injustices that involve individually small events that repeat themselves, causes that while bad would not individually produce significant inequality, but because they're systematic, they can aggregate differentially. Many concerns about the harms of discrimination and hate speech seem to assume something like this or work something like this. That is, the idea isn't that an individual act of hate speech was so harmful, but that lots of individual acts systematically applied are harmful. So what I want to do is talk about how this kind of explanation that tries to explain these really large and significant structural effects in terms of a bunch of small events. Let me give you some examples. First, the widely discussed implicit association task measures implicit associations. Multiple meta-analyses of it suggest that the results on this task are at best very small, have a very small predictive value in thinking about various criterion behaviors. And this has, for many people, raised the question about whether implicit bias has any relevance to contemporary group disparities. Certainly, when we look at the smallness of IAT effects on behavior and the hugeness of these kinds of disparities that we might want to explain, there'd be some reason for skepticism. On the other hand, Anthony Greenwald, who's one of you might think of him as the father of the implicit association task, and his colleagues, Mazarin Banaji and Brian Nosek, have suggested that these small effects of implicit bias can aggregate. So here's a passage from their 2015 paper. They say, regardless of inclusion policy, the meta-analyses estimated aggregate correlational sizes that were large enough to explain discriminatory impacts that are societally significant, either because they can affect many people simultaneously or because they can repeatedly affect single persons. Similarly, the literature on microaggressions has had a kind of pattern like this. Microaggressions, as you may know, is a term to pick out brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults towards people of color. That's maybe the most influential characterization from Darrell Sue in 2007. And the work on microaggressions is work I did with my student, Cameron Evans. So, if these microaggressions are commonplace, they nonetheless give rise to a couple of concerns. One of them is, don't we all experience kind of microaggressions all the time? And this was put this way, doesn't everyone, regardless of their race, occasionally experience verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities? And the second kind of concern that is how could these little tiny microaggressions, I mean, they're called microaggressions after all, how could small acts or events give rise to any kind of significant or deleterious outcomes? Michael Bloomberg, the former mayor of New York, put it this way, a microaggression is exactly that, it's micro. Again, the response of defenders of the relevance of microaggressions has been to appeal to the aggregation of small effects over time. And this is a nearly ubiquitous feature of the literature of people defending the importance of microaggressions. They talk about the cumulative weight, the constant continuing cumulative experience, the cumulative nature of these innocuous expressions, the frequency with the experience results in cumulative harm. They're continual, never-ending, and cumulative in nature. There are lots of other examples of aggregative explanations where we try to talk about really small causes or events that are small and they seem to have small effects and large consequences. For example, explanations of mushrooming pollution what Nixon calls slow violence against some communities, work suggesting multi-generational effects of racial trauma, cumulative effects of small preferences in producing racial segregation. Virginia Valian in 1997 talked about the aggregated effects of institutional bias against women over the course of many individual decisions, the path dependence of educational criminal records, or what people sometimes call the scarring effects of unemployment, that when you have unemployment at one time, it doesn't just affect your loss of income for that time, but it affects all of your future employment. What we're thinking about here is this issue of making a mountain out of a molehill. Critics of small causes are skeptical that they could have any important role to play in structural inequality, but aggregative explanations provide, at least in principle, a way for them to do so. So we have this kind of model that says, I don't care how small the cause is, if it's real, it can have this effect. So now I want to talk about what these explanations assume, these aggregative explanations. They assume some sort of what I called an accumulation mechanism. Now I note first that not every cause leaves an effect that accumulates or aggregates, right? So you go outside and a breeze blows against your face as you're walking. The next day you go outside, a breeze blows against your face again. The third day, another breeze blows against your face. But it's not the case that these breezes aggregate over time so that by the end of the week, you're marching into a stiff wind, right? They're gone. They are a cause, they have an effect, but they don't really leave an effect that accumulates or aggregates. Sorry about that. I seem to have. All right. Tell me if the screen stops advancing again. So when they do, when they do aggregate, sometimes some accumulated effects will wash out over time.
Ron, you're not sharing, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, let me try again. Sorry about that. Let's see. It stopped sharing.
Okay, it works. On display, perhaps?
All right, can you see the screen now?
It's small. It's not on display.
Not on the slide.
Not on display.
Not on display. Stop share. Share. How's that? Good?
It's the same. We see the outline of the slides, but not the, what is it called? The slideshow.
Yeah, it's not the slide share. It's just the.
Yeah. Okay, that's the button. Yeah. The slideshow.
Yeah, but he's tried. It doesn't go. It doesn't share.
Right.
All right. This would be great for people to watch later and they'll realize.
That's it. You got it.
Okay. Is that it? Okay. So so some effects of these of past events, of course, wash out over time. Someone may experience a traumatic second grade year in elementary school, but maybe by the time they're 30, their life is just exactly the way it would have been if they had not had that experience. So aggregative explanations need some kind of mechanism or some kind of situation in place in order for them to be successful. And I call this kind of mechanism an accumulation mechanism. So most people who discuss aggregation use analogies. For example, they talk about the compounding interest over time, or scarring effects, or as we saw, slow violence. Even the use of the term trauma to discuss the effects of racial discrimination is a kind of analogy, because the use of the term trauma had a very specific medical meaning, which is being extended to these kinds of cases. So here I want to offer a brief functional description of these accumulation mechanisms. As I think about them, accumulation mechanisms mark and aggregate the marks of past events, and they also ground and sometimes amplify advantage and disadvantage. So whenever a past event leaves some kind of trace or mark upon the world, there's going to be some medium of that mark, and there's going to be some kind of mechanism by which the trace is saved over time. So just to give you a few examples to kind of fill out this idea in your mind, you might think of a fire ripping through a pine grove, leaving a tree alive but scarred by the fire. Juanita's boss gives her a high marks for her job performance, leaving a mark in her employment record. Mo slips off his skateboard and breaks open his chin and leaves a mark upon his chin. Sometimes a series of similar past events will leave similar marks on the world, and in some cases they're saved up and in some way added up by accumulation mechanisms. For example, evidence from repeated scarring suggests a pine tree can survive 14 or more fires. You can sometimes check a pine grove and you can see how many fires the trees there have survived by looking at their scarring pattern. Juanita's employment record might contain many favorable reviews of her work. Mo's body might have numerous scars from his sporting escapades. And finally, grounding advantage or disadvantage. Some marks are going to ground advantage, and disadvantage are going to be that in virtue of which something has advantage or disadvantage. And sometimes they're going to cause advantage or disadvantage. So eventually the tree scars weakened it enough so that it succumbed to a drought. A review of her employment record might lead to a raise and a promotion for Juanita. Mo's numerous scars might lead some to find him less attractive. However, to others, they might make him more attractive. So when we talk about advantage and disadvantage, it's important to note that this is going to involve some comparison of an individual or a group to another individual or group, because individuals can be compared along many dimensions, or groups can be compared along many dimensions. Advantage and disadvantage are going to be typically very complex. We often treat them as very simple, but they're often very complex. It will be common, in fact, that the same property might advantage someone in some way, but disadvantage them in another, as in most cases of his scarring. So these kinds of marks can also amplify advantage and disadvantage. This is going to happen when marks or the accumulation of marks provide input to some further causal process that itself discriminates and produces disadvantage. So marks left by discrimination in education, for example, might be amplified by processes that rely on education in employment decisions. Okay, so just sort of to sum up here, people assume that there are these accumulation mechanisms because the existence of the right accumulation mechanism in principle allows arbitrarily tiny causes to explain arbitrarily large effects. And so what I'm trying to do here is to give a kind of general sketch, but we can look at some specific examples. Pretty straightforward example is wealth. The amount of wealth that many of us have is the result of many past small events. And insofar as systematic injustice entered into those events, those are going to affect our accumulation of wealth. We can think about also in terms of property. In my country, many people's wealth is tied up in their homes. About 2/3 of all wealth in North America are tied up in people's homes. And white Americans have from 7 or 9 times as much wealth as African American households. And so we can see that there could be many small events that would nonetheless lead up to big discrepancies over time. We can also think about criminal justice records as being accumulation mechanisms. Evidence suggests that in the US, the criminal justice system both amplifies discrimination and itself discriminates. And one's criminal justice record is an accumulation mechanism that grounds disadvantage, for example, in further employment opportunities. There's lots of other institutional marks, educational attainment, employment. Virginia Valiant talks a lot about professional reputation as a kind of record keeping that might harm women because of the way there's systematic bias in it. So not all accumulation mechanisms are going to be social institutional like the ones I just talked about. One example is we saw some claims about health, including psychological injury like chronic stress and trauma. So a big discussion lately in public health has been about accumulated injury that can come in many forms and affect, it seems, public health outcomes. One influential trend has been to suggest that persistent racism, perhaps in the form of biased behavior or microaggressions, has caused widespread post-traumatic stress disorder among American Blacks. Sometimes this is called race-based traumatic stress injury. And because of this trend, there's been an increasing attention to new psychological measures, like measures of perceived racism. The idea is that people who have more incidents of perceived racism would experience more stress and have more health outcomes. And so this would be a way of testing this kind of hypothesis. Okay, so I've offered a very general functional specification of accumulation mechanisms, and then I tried to give you some examples, and they're pretty varied. And I think that that's the right thing to say, that really the thing that we can say is going to be very general and functional rather than specific and concrete. And that's the way I think about this notion of accumulation mechanism. Nonetheless, despite its generality, it's a substantive model. Not all models that look like accumulation are accumulation. For example, if you're repeatedly exposed to a risk that doesn't accumulate, it can nonetheless produce significant harm without accumulation. It can look like an accumulation mechanism. So suppose that every time, Russian roulette is an example of this. If you pull the trigger and the bullet doesn't fire from the gun, then you're okay, unless you continue to play. But of course, if the bullet does fire, there's a kind of catastrophic harm. So some models of harms that result from, for example, incidences of racism look more like Russian roulette than they do look like accumulation mechanisms. They're kind of straw that broke the camel's back models, where you have a discontinuous function, a function that in which harm basically stays level, but then suddenly and rapidly increases in response to some unlucky incident. So there are many possible mechanisms that can produce accumulation of small harms, and I've tried to give an idea of the variety of them. Now I want to switch gears a little bit, and I'm not going to go deep into political philosophy. And what I would like to do, I hope, is to state some claims that are going to be pretty uncontentious. And I'm doing that just by asking this question: what would a just and fair and good world look like? And I take it the following as a not very controversial claim. A just, fair, and good world has some historically produced distributions of goods. That is, some of the goods that people have and the distributions of those goods is going to be determined by things that occurred in the past, even in this just, fair, and good world that we hypothesize. So here's just an argument for that, I take it, not very controversial point. It looks like various moral values demand a kind of historically sensitive distribution of good. For example, if desert is a moral value, it seems like thoughts like people who work hard deserve to get ahead, and people who work harder deserve more than people who worked less hard, or shirkers. It also seems like people who commit crimes deserve punishment, or at least they sacrifice some of their freedoms or something like that. Also, things like fairness, values like fairness, even if you think fairness is somehow an egalitarian political value, even ideas like taking turns. If every time we go out to lunch, we take turns deciding who to go, where to go for lunch, and you chose yesterday, then today I get to choose. And taking account of that historical fact about who chose yesterday seems relevant to deciding what is fair today. Or ownership rights. It seems like ownership rights to one's property, one's wealth, or even to one's body probably depend in some way on the history, the particular connection. You don't have rights to your body in virtue of deserving them or in virtue of it being fair. You have some other kind of right to your body and to your property as well. So here's the point. These historic distributions themselves require accumulation mechanisms. That is, we need mechanisms that track, for example, educational achievement, economic rights, entitlements, and obligations over time. And these mechanisms, like educational records, criminal records, property records, employment records, bank records, and so forth, are just accumulation mechanisms in the sense I described. They serve to mark and aggregate past events in ways that ground and sometimes amplify advantage and disadvantage. These are many of the same institutions, you will have noticed. Many of the same mechanisms that are manifestations of moral notions like fairness, desert, and ownership are also mechanisms that can serve to aggregate unjust individual events into significant harms. And I think they do the latter because they do the former. That is, it is because we take them to be morally legitimate and even vital institutions that they can also ground unjust structural advantage and disadvantage. This is a kind of identity claim. I'll call this a kind of moral two-facedness of some accumulation mechanisms. So I don't think that all accumulation mechanisms are two-faced. For example, I don't think that anyone deserves to have chronic stress-related illness or to get cancer because they live in a polluted environment, even though the body and the environment can be accumulation mechanisms. So the clearest cases of two-facedness will be formal and informal social arrangements and institutions, I think, that serve as accumulation mechanisms. And that's just because we have these social arrangements and institutions because they serve these aims that we have, and at the same time they serve as accumulation mechanisms that may ground advantage or cause advantage or disadvantage. So when we think about these two faces and contrast, we're going to get a very different contrast depending on how we think about them. So suppose we have an institutional mechanism whose purpose is to track some historical and morally relevant property. And I'm going to choose kind of educational achievement, maybe because I'm an academic, but I see that, you know, some people might not like this example or might think that there shouldn't be accumulation mechanisms in this way. Suppose we have an educational system that, in the absence of systematic bias or excessive noise, is well designed to track things like talent, educational accomplishment, and educational desert. That is, when it tracks them and it rewards for them. So when we have this system and we compare two people or maybe two groups that are not subject to systematic bias, we're going to find that individuals who excel are appropriately rewarded for their excellence. That is, to put it in a very concrete way, if you were to take yourself and compare yourself to another person, and if you and this other person were not subject to systematic bias, or possibly if you were subject to the same level of systematic bias, so that's a little more complicated, and you would see that the rewards that you received were somehow appropriate to the excellence you exhibited in this kind of system. But of course, if we compare two people or groups subject to different systematic biases, we no longer have a system that rewards excellence. Although because of the first claim, it continues to appear to do so. So it follows from this kind of line of thinking that the moral values we appeal to in an attempt to address structural injustice in two-faced structures will typically be opposed by appeal to other moral values that the same structures serve to satisfy. For example, we'll see claims about hard work and rewarding it opposed to worries about handouts and shirkers, just to use the vocabulary of the just institution, as it were, against the claims of systematic injustice. We'll hear claims about earned positions versus unearned quotas or unearned entitlements, and so forth. So I think that by itself is a kind of important observation to make, that that we ought to be thinking about the two faces of these systems when we're thinking about the systematic injustice they perpetuate, because I don't see us as being able to come to some better social arrangements until we think about these two faces together. I think this also plays out and in this idea about how we interpret these institutions. Many people will be inclined to interpret many social institutions in a modern Western country like the United States as just. In fact, there's a psychological measure called belief in a just world, People who believe in a just world, that is, they believe that the world is already more or less just. And they're much more likely to be opposed to things like affirmative action or other kinds of rectification policies, because they don't believe that the world is already that unjust. On the other hand, when we focus on these same institutions in the context of acknowledging structural injustice, the kind of structural injustice I talked about that you can see written in any American city, it's tempting to view these claims about justice as the justice served by these institutions as somehow being in bad faith, or as being a kind of ideology which is just serving to protect privilege as against these claims for justice on the basis of historic events. So I think that obviously I'm sympathetic to the idea that these events do play important roles in serving our moral values, in advancing our moral aims. But at the same time, I hope it's obvious that I'm sympathetic to the idea that there is significant and important structural injustice as a result of these past events. So when we think about it in this way, we can think about different sets of interventions that approach accumulation mechanisms that either do or don't try to take on the two-facedness. Some interventions are pretty straightforward in that they don't involve confronting the moral aims of these structures. For example, we might think that what we just need to do is keep the same educational system that serves the ideal meritocracy, as it were. But what we need to do is reduce systematic bias in those institutions and in their conduct and so on, because the systematic bias and also noise gives input to the structures that serve as accumulation mechanisms and leads them not to, as it were, reward merit or whatever it is they're supposed to, whatever values they're supposed to reward. We can also, when we're thinking about interventions on structure, think about non-two-faced structures. As I said, not all accumulation mechanisms are going to have this two-faced character. For example, we can think about ensuring healthcare and a clean environment and opportunities sort of across the board. There's no reason that in doing that, we need to sort of change the structure or question the outcome of these things. But some harder interventions, if what I've said is right, would be because of this sort of two-facedness. These are interventions that seek to reset or redo the outcomes of these institutions, which in part serve to advance these moral values. For example, rectification and reparation involves somehow acknowledging historic injustices and directly seeking to reset the accumulations that have resulted. As I said, this only is going to work for some sorts of structural advantages, but it's also going to require that we sort of answer or try to figure out how to answer these kinds of moral claims against. And there's also the idea that used to maybe be more common. I think of Iris, Mary, and Young as having a view like this, that acknowledging some systematic injustice, we ought to acknowledge that some systematic justice is ineliminable. And so we ought to then institute ongoing mechanisms to a certain sense, reset and restore some default level of opportunity or equality as a result. In particular, I think that in any free society, there'll be some systematic injustice, because eliminating it completely from people's behaviors and actions would be to not be in a free society anymore. So I'm going to just stop there, and just what I've tried to do here is just introduce and describe this idea of accumulation mechanisms as a way of making sense of getting these big harms out of these very small causes, and then talk about their moral two-facedness as a particular kind of challenge for addressing the inequalities that they ground and cause. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was terrific. Love this so much. So the floor is open for questions. Sally first.
Why don't you ask Francesco? I've gone first so many times.
Sorry, like I'm confused with the hands. Francesco, yes. Or first.
Well, thanks. And thank you for the talk. I mean, it was very, very inspiring. And I mean, I particularly liked your Berlinian, in the sense of Isaiah-Berlin kind of idea that, you know, in the end, you know, we might have to accept that there are just some values and, that are in conflict, and therefore, you know, we have to live with this to some extent. So I guess, you know, my question is about the very few slides at the end where you suggested that we might have some, there might be some institutions that do not have this sort of systemic injustice feature. And I mean, in light of what you were saying earlier, I would be somewhat skeptical about this. And my take would be that, you know, my instinct is to say that even, you know, those institutions that from time to time, for example, reset and, you know, and redistribute, for example, resources at some point and say, okay, let's start all over again because there is too much accumulation, for example. I mean, these would also be, to some extent, a form of systemic injustice, in the sense that, for example, you know, they would hit systematically the most talented people. So I was wondering whether, you know, rather than saying, okay, you know, let's look for institutions that are not systemically unjust, we should just, you know, make sure that people are aware of the fact that, you know, in any society that achieves a certain equilibrium or balance needs to strike a compromise between, you know, these different values, these different aspects of justice, and we have to accept that there are going to be conflicts. And there isn't, unfortunately, a rule book that says, okay, what is the right compromise here? You know, how often are we going to reset, for example, to redistribute? But, you know, that's something that probably through political negotiation, you know, different societies are going to find different kinds of equilibria. And maybe, you know, the only general lesson is that, you know, we should beware of, you know, getting stuck with institutions that too obviously disrupt the balance that a well-functioning society, especially democratic society, requires in order to work well. So I just wonder what you thought about this. I mean, are you are you optimistic or not about, you know, finding these non-systemically unjust institutions?
So let's see, I totally agree with you about the idea of a conflict, of an ongoing kind of conflict, and that is a matter of balancing. You know, I think it's easy to find examples. I think that there's some kind of, I think freedom of speech probably imposes costs on some people, and it benefits others. And I think probably the regulation of speech is harmful enough that it outweighs, you know, there would be some goods that come from more regulation of speech, and but it would be more harmful than beneficial to do so. I think that's a general thought, and I like your idea of promulgating the trade-off, as it were, or the idea that there's a kind of a trade-off of values, how that could work politically. I'm less certain of. I often think about metaphors. You know, I think of contemporary society as like a game of Monopoly, but at the end, instead of the game, someone winning the game because everyone else goes out of business, as it were, the game just keeps going. You can't stop it and play another game. It just keeps going. And the people with a lot of money who own all the properties, they just keep owning all the properties. So I think that some kind of way of communicating this idea of a trade-off seems important. So I think I didn't want to say there were institutions that didn't exhibit this trade-off. I think there are accumulation mechanisms that don't exhibit this two-facedness. Like I don't think that it's, although people will say it, I don't think that it's right mostly to think that someone's bad health reflects their desert. In some cases, we might say the smoker who wouldn't quit smoking or something like that might think that, or the careless stunt skateboard rider like Mo deserves all the scars he gets. But mostly I think that's not a mechanism that exhibits two-facedness.
That's great. So Sally is next.
So if anybody who hasn't asked a question yet wants to ask a question, I think you should jump in.
We also had,
Catherine.
yeah.
Catherine does.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks. I think it's just a clarification. I feel like I might be missing something just with the last exchange. So why think that structural injustice is unavoidable in a free society? I mean, there might be some bad effects in the way that people exercise their liberties, or there might be some instances of unfairness, but why think that structural injustice is something that we're going to, right, like the structural part of it, not just like certain episodes, or does that question make sense? Yeah, thanks.
No, I think you're right. So I'm going to give a first pass answer, and then I think you'll say, but that's not structural injustice. So one kind of thought is that if you think about a case like Nozick's Wilt-Chamberlain case, right? So one kind of natural thing to think from that, and what Rawls thinks about it, is that you can have, as it were, structural injustice of a kind emerge even in the absence of systematic injustice in history. So I think the right thing now is that you might say that's obviously a case about an individual person.
I'd say it's inequality. Like
Right.
it's a pattern of inequality that arises, but there's a further question about whether that's unjust.
Right. So no, I agree that there's a further question about whether it's unjust. And I thought you were going to say there's a further question about whether it's structural or systematic also. Yeah, so, okay. I think that I'm thinking about why I think this, and I think that structural injustice is going to emerge in the way that inequality emerges in the Wilt-Chamberlain case. But I don't think that maybe I've shown that in the paper. And so I think maybe I need to think more about that. Thank you.
Great. That's a good point. So I think Sally, you're next. I don't see other hands.
Okay, thanks, Ron. Great paper. I learned a lot. I'm really interested in what you're doing. So I think this isn't any concern with what you've said, but more a question about other ways that you can have kind of cascading effects from micro events. And it's not just that there's an accumulation of the harm on an individual or accumulation of what's recorded, things like that in this, but it's about more about the looping effects. So So consider, for example, in an ecosystem, if one organism in the ecosystem gets a certain disease or pathogen that then affects the water, so it's dispersed into the water, so that everybody else, all the other organisms, are now exposed to it, or that due to the pathogen, some organisms get it, the temperature rises, and that affects other things. So it's these, and these kind of cascading effects are well known in ecosystems. And it's that the way you think about it is that these things affect the background conditions, or affect the relations, or affect other kinds of things, which then affect the new or the other members of the system, other entities that are in the system. And it seems that that's the sort of thing that can happen even by accident in social contexts. So, the IRS changes its website by accident puts a form on that's, from an old, that can have huge cascading effects on how much taxes people pay and how they, et cetera. It's huge. And it was just an accident, right? But it was tiny little accident. Boom, it has these huge cascading effects on distribution of wealth and whatever. And even in department, when we talk about academic settings, climate in a milieu, and there's a small racist incident, but it's viewed by others, and then that changes the conversational norms, so to speak, as some might say, about it's what is permissible to say or do, and then there can be kind of cascades in that way too. And so I was just interested in and whether this you think would fall under the kind of accumulation you have in mind, if it's a different kind of cascading effects from micro events, or how you want to think about it.
Good. I really like that question. I don't doubt, in a certain way, you're talking about kind of non-obvious. So I have this model of accumulation mechanisms, and intuitively the idea is sort of the same sort of event makes the same sort of effect. The same sort of effect accumulates. Maybe it causes some other kinds of things. And you're really thinking about cases where maybe there are a bunch of different sorts of events linked together. And by different sorts, I mean different types. So you have a criminal justice system, say that's harder on African-American men. So lots more of them are in prison, and now you have a neighborhood that's missing a lot of African-American men, and that changes the parenting and the family structures in that neighborhood. And then that has these other effects, and so on. And so in that kind of case, I think I could explain it in terms of also of accumulation mechanisms sort of linked together one after another. But then in the specific cases you gave, you seem to have in mind the idea of a case where there's some crucial event, a kind of butterfly flapping its wings, and then the whole system changes states or something. And I absolutely think that can happen. And maybe that we can even model types of it happening. The butterfly flapping its wings analogies register some skepticism about being able to describe specifically a type of event, because it makes every event like that sound particular. But I suspect, yeah, so anyway, so one tool I have is this linking together accumulation mechanisms as types. But insofar as that fails, I think that the right thing to say is that that could completely happen, and that it's a different model or something than what I'm talking about.
That's really helpful, because I was thinking, the butterfly effect is sort of a name for something that is actually much more common then that makes it seem like it is. I mean, that seems
Yeah,
a little weird. But this idea, yeah, you started with the micro events, and I was thinking of how can micro events, accumulate, or in the sense, but not accumulate, they generate, so to speak, a cascade of other events. And yeah, I think that there's probably the cascade sometimes happens by accumulation, and sometimes it happens in this other way. And yeah, that's great.
Thank you. I want to go back to Catherine's question and have another stab. I think the thing is that I think the reason, I think that in a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multiracial state, I think some group-based, group-directed discrimination is probably inevitable short of massive state intervention in people's personal lives. And I think where there is that, then they'll turn out to be, I think they'll turn out to, the result of that over time will be a kind of structural injustice. So there's a kind of model you can have of such a society in which we have completely horizontal groups. None of them really have an advantage. They all have their internal norms, and none of them are especially dominant over another. And I don't know that there are any states that actually operate that way, but it is a kind of model and an ideal to keep in mind. But when we look at the states that we do have that are multi-ethnic and multiracial, there tend to be some groups that are more privileged than others, at least in various respects. And given that background condition, that's probably why I think that. Anyway, I appreciate your question. It's very much to the point.
That's great. So any other questions, comments, reactions? Still have 6 minutes. So if there are no other hands raised, I'm interested in terms of, so you mentioned the idea of compounding as a way of sort of the aggregate mechanism. Would you think about compounding power on the same pattern, in the sense that, like, let's say one social group has more power, let's say in one social domain, and then that enables them to acquire more power in any other, like multiple social arenas, or I'm thinking, like, to make it not just about the power, like think of loss of the power, for instance, just being part of a disadvantaged group. It's an interesting study by LaCroix and Kaylin O'Connor when they talk about power by association. So just merely being associated with someone powerful from a powerful group will kind of lead to developing a convention that you, even if you're not powerful as an individual, will acquire more power in your interactions with disadvantaged members of the disadvantaged group. And the reverse is true. You may be a powerful person of a disadvantaged group and thereby kind of end up having disadvantages because of the interactions that you have with members of a powerful group, even if they're not powerful individuals. Would that kind of fit on your kind of aggregate mechanism, the way of compounding power in virtue of your group membership?
Yeah, so power is of course an essential notion, and it's difficult to think about how to theorize it, as it were. So one thing I think is that there are groups that manage to sustain power over very long periods of time, which is, yeah. And so there's this work by this economist, Gregory Clark, The Sun Also Rises is his book reporting this stuff, where he talks about families retaining their social status over huge amounts of time, hundreds and hundreds of years, and across multiple social revolutions in their countries, even in countries we think of as very egalitarian, like Northern Europe, even in countries like China, which has undergone a massive social revolution in the last century, and maybe more than one. And his takeaway from it is that we can't think about social status or power in terms of money alone, because we can talk about it when we talk about an egalitarian country, and the Scandinavian countries figure prominently when we think about these. We're really talking about countries that redistribute monetary wealth more than other countries may do. But even in those countries, social status remains and is retained, so that people in high status positions today are much more likely to be the descendants of high status noble persons hundreds of years ago than the descendants of low status social individuals hundreds of years ago. So one kind of takeaway from this is that it's wrong to think about this idea about social status totally in terms of economic power, of money, of wealth, so that's kind of an interesting claim. And his sort of takeaway from it is, I mean, you can think about this in various ways. You can be a pessimist and think that of course, that we could redistribute money, but we can't redistribute social status, and that's too bad because it's unfair. You could be more of an optimist about it and think that people they can give up a lot of their money without giving up anything that seems important to them, so that the barriers to redistribution of wealth ought to be lower than sometimes we imagine that they might be, and in a more egalitarian society. Yeah, so I'm not sure I have anything very insightful to say about power, other than I don't think that the kind of power that's involved in structural advantage or disadvantage is always or all about wealth and money. And there are various kinds of other capital, as it were. Some of it might be health. This economist, I should say, seems to think that there's some, he's weirdly essentialist about it. He thinks there's some sort of social capacity that these families have that leads them to be able to sustain their social position over time. But it is interesting to think about how that could, what could be going on.
Yeah. I didn't mean necessarily to put it on in terms of power, but like advantages and disadvantages, which obviously come typically with power or lack of. But yeah, that's interesting. Are there any other questions? I think we're kind of right on time. Obviously, feel free to use the break to continue discussion, and otherwise I see you in 9 minutes for Colleen's talk. Thank you again. That's really, really good.